The storm came without warning, tearing through the Boston night like a wounded animal. Rain clawed at the glass dome of the Whitmore estate, each flash of lightning splintering across the marble floors like shattered diamonds. Inside, opulence sat on a throne of silence until it cracked. Meredith Whitmore's voice sliced through the air, sharp and venomous, echoing off golden columns. Her hand, wrapped in silken rage, hurled a crystal wine glass toward the frail figure collapsing on the marble. Helena Whitmore, matriarch of the empire, trembled violently as Parkinson seized her body, her thin frame crumpling like paper under the weight of her years. The stemware spun in slow motion through the storm-lit air. A red comet aimed to erase what dignity remained of her. Evan Hart moved before he could think. His black uniform blurred across the atrium, the small rainbow pin on his chest flashing once like defiance itself. Glass exploded against his arm, slicing deep. Blood blossomed across his sleeve, a vivid bloom of sacrifice on cold stone. Helena whimpered, clutching at him, her body shaking against his. Meredith's heels clicked closer, her mouth twisting into something cruel. Filthy little gay servant. She hissed, "Get out of this house." Beyond the marble archway, hidden in shadow, Richard Whitmore froze. The heir to a billion-dollar empire stood silent, rooted by something heavier than shock. His mother, his unbreakable, untouchable mother, was sobbing into the chest of a servant, while his wife stood smiling like she had won. Rain hammered the skylight as if trying to break in, and for the first time, Richard saw the rot coiled inside the home he thought was perfect. He didn't move, didn't breathe, couldn't. The chandelier above swayed with the storm's breath, scattering shards of light across the chaos below. Evan's blood trailed onto the marble, winding like a scar across the empire's polished heart. Meredith turned away with a scoff, already savoring her victory. Richard stayed hidden, his jaw locked. As Helena's thin shoulders shook and Evan held her like something breakable, yet worth saving. That night would become a fault line, the moment when silence could no longer protect them. The night the empire's marble walls learned what loyalty looked like and what cruelty sounded like. Because sometimes the bravest act isn't raising your voice. It's standing still, bleeding quietly, refusing to let the people you love collapse. If you believe loyalty and silent sacrifice deserve to be remembered, follow Heart Stories, where we honor the unseen hearts who hold entire families together. Morning crept across the Whitmore estate with pale winter light, brushing cold fingers along the marble where blood had dried to a muted rust. The grandeur stood untouched, but the air had shifted tense, brittle, like porcelain about to crack. Meredith descended the grand staircase wrapped in cream cashmere and false fragility, her face composed into delicate grief. With practiced poise, she summoned the household staff, spinning her tale as though reading from a script. She said Evan had created chaos, had threatened Helena in the night, had crossed the line from servant to danger. She spoke of disruption, of impropriety, of someone who no longer belonged among them. Richard stood silent near the hearth, shoulders squared as though bracing against invisible blows. Meredith's words wound around him like smoke, and he let them, choosing the comfort of blindness over the discomfort of doubt. He did not glance at the faint crimson stain on the floor, or the shards swept neatly away. He did not let himself remember the way Helena had clung to Evan's chest as though it were the last safe place left in the world. Instead, he let Meredith guide his hand toward the match that would burn Evan out of their lives. By noon, the household gathered in the atrium under the watchful stare of ancestral portraits. Meredith stood like a queen behind Richard as he delivered the verdict. His voice was steady, but it cracked in the silence between words. Evan was to leave immediately. No further explanation, no chance to defend himself, just exile. Evan didn't argue. He didn't lift his eyes. He only bowed his head once in acknowledgement, the rainbow pin on his chest glinting faintly as if reluctant to go dark. He walked out between towering marble columns that had watched generations rise and fall, each step hollow against the polished stone. Behind him, whispers stirred, half relief, half unease. The massive doors closed, sealing him from the empire he had quietly protected. The afternoon bled into a gray, formless night. In a small, rented room across town, Evan folded his uniform with aching precision and placed it beside the single photograph he carried everywhere, his mother smiling under the summer sun before chemotherapy stole her hair. She was in Atlanta now, clinging to life while medical bills mounted like storm clouds. Evan pressed his forehead to the frame and let the silence swallow him whole. Back at the estate, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at nothing while the storm returned. Rain ticked against the windows like restless fingers. He could not name the unease gnawing at him, only feel its teeth. Sleep refused him, so he turned to the cameras, a desperate attempt to anchor himself in certainty. He scrolled past empty corridors, endless halls, until the atrium flickered onto the screen. The footage hit him like a blow. The glass hadn't slipped. Meredith's arm had cut the air in a sharp arc, hurling the crystal toward Helena's fragile frame. Evan had leapt forward, not to harm, but to shield. The wine had burst across his sleeve, not hers. Richard watched the blood spread in a blooming shadow while Helena clung to him like a child lost in the dark. Shame scalded him. The empire he had sworn to protect had devoured its most loyal soul, and he had watched it happen. By dawn, he was at a modest diner tucked between shuttered storefronts, breath fogging the window as rain tapped at the glass. Evan stood behind the counter, exhaustion hollowing his face. Richard crossed the room and spoke as if surfacing from underwater. He admitted his failure, his blindness, his need to make it right. He promised triple the salary. He vowed to cover every cent of his mother's treatment. Evan met his gaze and did not flinch. "I will come back," he said quietly, "but not only to work. I will come back to protect a secret I have carried for 30 years. There are moments when justice is not grand or public. Sometimes it begins as a private reckoning, a quiet decision to stop repeating harm simply because silence feels easier." Evan Hart returned to the Whitmore estate under a different kind of silence. The grandeur still stood chandeliers glittering like frozen constellations, the scent of polished oak lingering in every hall, but the air had shifted. Where whispers once trailed behind him like shadows, they now lingered ahead of him, cold and sharp, as if the house itself questioned why he had dared to come back. Meredith had vanished without farewell, her absence hanging over the corridors like perfume gone stale. Yet suspicion remained, coiling in the glances of housekeepers who averted their eyes too quickly, in the clipped greetings of butlers who spoke his name as if it were a trespass. He no longer worked among them. Richard had placed him solely by Helena's side, tasked not with dusting heirlooms, but with guarding the fragile pulse of the matriarch. Her world had shrunk to a gilded bedroom overlooking the East Gardens, where sunlight painted her silver hair in thin gold ribbons when she dozed. Parkinson's had hollowed her strength, but her mind still sparked in sudden flashes, sharp enough to cut through haze. Evan tended to her with the quiet precision of someone rebuilding a cathedral from crumbling stone, steady hands, smoothing her trembling ones, patient words filling the silence that fear left behind. Nights blurred into one another, lit only by the soft glow of her bedside lamp. The house grew hushed after midnight, corridors stretching into darkness while the storm winds prowled the coast outside. One such night, when the grandfather clock struck the hour with a hollow chime, Helena's body convulsed in pain. Evan was at her side instantly, steadying her frail shoulders, pressing the emergency call button with a practiced hand. Her chest rose in shallow gasps as the color drained from her lips. Her fingers clutched his wrist like iron despite their paper-thin skin. "If I don't make it," she rasped, voice barely more than air. "Tell him." The words rooted inside him like a blade. For years he had carried the truth as if it were a shard of glass pressed to his heart, too dangerous to drop, too sacred to reveal. Now the weight demanded release. By dawn, the worst had passed. Helena slept under a fortress of blankets while monitors hummed like distant bees. Richard arrived hours later, his tailored suit still bearing the wrinkles of panic, his eyes dark from sleeplessness. He found Evan standing at the window, back straight, gaze distant over the rain-streaked gardens. "What did she mean?" Richard asked. His voice thin, Evan turned. The mask of composure faltered. Just once. Then he spoke, each word carved from the years he had buried them. "You are not Helena's biological son. Your mother had an affair with your father's younger brother. Helena knew, and she chose to raise you as her own." Silence rippled through the room, heavier than grief. Richard stood as if the floor had shifted beneath him. The version of himself he had always known, heir by blood, rightful successor fractured in a single breath. Hours later, Helena stirred. Her eyes opened, clouded but certain. Richard sat at her side, trembling like a boy again. "Is it true?" he whispered. Her answer came without hesitation. She had known. She had seen the betrayal and decided love mattered more than bloodlines. She had wrapped him in her name, her protection, her fierce devotion, not because she had to, but because she chose to. The dam inside him broke. Richard collapsed forward, clutching her frail hand, tears streaking down the man who had never been allowed to cry. "I don't care who gave me life." He choked. "You gave me everything." In that quiet, something shifted between them, not status, not duty, but truth. The house outside remained unchanged, its marble walls cold and gleaming. Yet for the first time, Richard felt the foundation beneath them was not heritage or wealth, but the deliberate act of love. Some truths cut like glass, but some mend like gold. What survives is not the blood that made us, but the love that kept us. Morning light pooled through the vast windows of the Whitmore atrium, spilling across the marble-like melted gold. It caught in the gilt frames of oil portraits, in the veins of the stone floor, in the curls of steam rising from the hearth, where the estate had so often felt like a cathedral of coldness. Today, it pulsed faintly with something warmer, like the first trace of spring pressing its fingers against winter's glass. The staff assembled in a nervous semicircle beneath the chandelier, their crisp uniforms forming a wall of muted tension. They had been summoned without explanation. They whispered about inheritance, about new rules, about what scandal might follow the disappearance of Meredith. Then Richard Whitmore appeared at the head of the grand staircase, his footsteps steady, his gaze like cut crystal. Gone was the quiet uncertainty that had once hollowed his posture. He stood like a man who had burned through illusion and come out the other side. At the center of the atrium, he stopped, letting silence draw tight as wire. Helena sat nearby in her wheelchair, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, the firelight tracing her profile. Her frailty was undeniable, yet her eyes gleamed with an almost fierce pride as she watched him. Richard let his gaze sweep across the line of staff, past the butler who had once flinched at Evan's name, past the housekeepers who had whispered in doorways, until it landed on Evan Hart. Evan stood slightly apart, hands folded neatly, dressed in his black uniform, though it no longer defined him. The rainbow pin still glinted on his chest, no longer small or apologetic, but bright as if it had been waiting for this moment, to this day forward. Richard began, voice carrying like the strike of a bell. "Evan Hart is no longer a servant in this house. He is family. Anyone who cannot respect him will not remain under this roof." The words fell into the marble silence like stones into still water, sending ripples that broke across every rigid face. The old hierarchy cracked. No one spoke. Not even the portraits seemed to dare. Richard continued, not as the heir to a fortune, but as a son who had just learned what inheritance truly meant. He announced that if anything ever happened to him, Evan would oversee the estate in the Whitmore Philanthropic Trust. Murmurs stirred like the rustle of dry leaves, but none challenged him. Behind the shock was something quieter relief. Perhaps that someone willing to bleed for this house would now be allowed to guide it. Later that afternoon, in the hushed stillness of the study, Richard set a thick envelope on the mahogany desk between them. Inside lay a check for $2 million and a signed document appointing Evan to the board of the Whitmore Foundation. The fire hissed softly as if straining to hear. Evan stared at the envelope as though it were a weight too heavy to lift. His fingers hovered, then withdrew. "I don't want your money," he said at last. his voice low but certain. Richard's answer came as a simple smile, small yet unshakable. You deserve it. Not because of what you've done, but because of what you've endured. Something in the room softened. Not the wealth, not the grandeur, but the coldness that had ruled over both. For the first time, it felt less like a fortress and more like a home, less about control, more about belonging. The empire had always measured worth by legacy, by birthright, by blood. But in that moment, it bowed quietly to something harder to quantify: endurance, loyalty, and the grace to rise where no one expected you to stand. Respect built on fear collapses when fear fades. Respect built on truth endures, even when marble cracks. The Whitmore estate stood cloaked in stillness, the kind that only follows an ending. In the east wing, sunlight fell gently over Helena Whitmore's empty chair, its cushions indented where her frail frame had rested through countless winters. She had slipped away in her sleep days earlier, her last breath soft as silk unraveling. The house had not been the same since. Even the marble seemed to hold its echo, as if waiting for her cane's slow rhythm against the floor. Servants moved like shadows, speaking in murmurs. For the first time in decades, the empire had no matriarch. On the morning of the will reading, the Whitmore boardroom felt like a mausoleum of power. Velvet drapes muted the sunlight, casting a heavy gloom over the long oak table. Oil portraits of ancestors watched from the walls, faces carved in oil and arrogance. Richard sat at the head, posture taut, the weight of legacy pressing against his spine. He wore black, but not grief's black authority's black, the kind worn when the world expects you to rise before you've finished mourning. Beside him, a cluster of trustees shuffled papers and cleared throats, already planning futures in whispers. Evan Hart entered quietly, dressed in a simple charcoal suit, the rainbow pin still at his chest like a flicker of defiance against the gloom. He did not take a seat immediately. He paused by the window, watching the garden sway in the wind as if grounding himself before walking into the heart of an empire that had once expelled him. Then he sat, opposite Richard, their eyes locking briefly across the polished table. The family attorney rose, glasses perched at the tip of his nose, and opened the thick folder that held Helena's last words. His voice was steady, practiced, as he spoke of properties, accounts, charitable trusts. The list stretched on like an inventory of centuries until it stopped. Then came the sentence that split the air like lightning through stone. Helena Whitmore, the attorney read, bequeaths controlling shares of Whitmore Industries to Evan Hart. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The world seemed to lean inward. The trustees froze mid-note. The portraits loomed closer. Richard's chair scraped sharply against the marble as he rose, color draining from his face. What he managed, voice cracking through the silence. Evan did not flinch. He met Richard's gaze with calm, steady as tide. Because I was not only her caregiver, he said softly, oh no, I was her legally adopted son. She took me in when I was 16, abandoned and alone, and called me her second child behind closed doors. Gasps rippled through the room like breaking glass. The empire's golden narrative shattered. This man they had dismissed, this servant they had scorned, had been family all along. Richard stood very still, as though the world had shifted beneath him yet again. Then something gave way. His shoulders eased, his lips trembled, not with anger, but with something raw. He stepped around the table, each footstep echoing like a drumbeat. And then, without a word, he embraced Evan, clutching him tight as if afraid he might vanish. I didn't lose a mother, Richard whispered into the silence. I gained a brother. Outside, the sky cleared after weeks of storm. Light poured through the windows in a sudden cascade, washing the room in gold. The empire that had been built on cold marble glowed warm for the first time, not from wealth, but from truth and from love reclaimed. Families are not just the ones who share our blood, but the ones who stand beside us when the world tries to erase us. Helena had known that, and in the end, she chose a legacy not by lineage, but by loyalty. Do you think love and loyalty can matter more than bloodlines? Comment loyalty if you believe chosen family deserves to be honored, and follow heart stories to witness more untold battles of the quiet hearts who protect the people they love.